It's so easy, I think, in times like this when the world can seem such a harsh, difficult place. It's so easy to lose hope. It's so difficult to maintain hope in the face of the disappointments that we experience, both in terms of what we watch on the news and also what we experience in our own personal lives. I'll be honest with you, the last couple of years we've had lots of tragedy in our church community. Some of us may know about that, some of that's very personal and hasn't been shared publicly, but many of us are going through a lot of grief, broken relationships, death and loss, a lot of grief. Again, I just want to remind everybody of that workshop we have right after the service in room 202 for anybody struggling with grief right now as we enter the holiday seasons. But those things can just grind you down, and it's really difficult to maintain hope in those contexts. So I'm just to sort of close out our time together today, I'm going to invite somebody to come up in just a second, and I'm going to interview them up here about how they have in their life's journey, and they've been alive quite a long time. They won't mind me saying that, I'm sure. But I'm going to interview them and find out, so we can hear from them a little bit of their life's journey and how they've maintained hope and how they've persevered in the context of darkness and how they've sought to bring light rather than darkness throughout their lives. And that person is my father, who is the ripe old age of 81. Or he's a young chap, really, but I'm going to invite him up now, Mr. Johnny Dyer. Would you like to come up? So, careful on those steps. Oh, you can sit in that one. That's the one I usually sit in, but you can sit in that one. That's okay. Taking over. No, you definitely not. There you go. There you go. It's just that there's a trapdoor under this one that so this is my beloved father, and we talked a while ago about how our concept of God is often dictated often by our family of origin and that kind of thing. And my dad is not God, but my dad is a really great guy. I feel very, very fortunate to have had a dad like you. So, but I just thought so my, jokes aside, you've been alive quite a long time. You're 81 years old. That's now, right? If you hold up the microphone, then this is modern technology. But and so I've certainly observed in you that I've known you all your life, obviously, but that you've not, life hasn't always been easy for you.
No.
But you have maintained hope, you've maintained faith, and you've been someone who's experienced peace in your life, even when life hasn't always been peaceful. So I just wanted to ask you a few questions about that, and that might inspire us to pursue peace and pursue hope ourselves. So first of all, tell us a little bit about growing up. So 81 years ago in England, what was that like for you growing up?
Well, I was born in 1934, which means that I was, the Second World War occurred 5 years later. So I was born into that era, and was born into what I would describe, what people would describe today as a dysfunctional family. My mother had...
It's amazing I was as well.
I've been trying to hide that fact for years. But my mother's husband died at a very early age, and she produced 2 children. I don't think I've really told you much about them, and they were my stepbrother and stepsister, Fred and Violet, and then he died at an early age, and we lost contact with those 2 children. And then my mother was on her own, and in order to sort of fill the gap of loneliness, she linked up with a man who was obviously, or could have been, our father. His name was Jack Daly. He was an Irishman, and he maintained an on and off sort of relationship with my mother, and in the process produced 4 children. So we had my older sister Irene, I was number 2, my sister Catherine, who actually lives in America now, and my sister Eileen.
So you didn't have it. So tell us a little bit. So it wasn't a stable environment, a stable family. So what happened to you?
So by something like 3 years of age, I think it was maybe a little older, we were put into what they called in those days, because we were just sort of coming out of the Victorian era, and we were put into the workhouse, the whole family, and we were taken over and looked after or supervised by what was the equivalent of the social services in those days. And but then things got worse, and eventually the powers that be decided to put my older sister and myself into a home which was called London County Council Residential Home. In fact, it was an institution or an orphanage, and she was put into the girls' side, I was put into the boys' side. My second sister, Catherine, she was adopted, and then the youngest sister, Eileen, she remained with my mother for the rest of her days until she got married.
What were some of your memories of that time, like being in that orphanage?
I can remember the first night of arriving at the orphanage, being in the playground, and my recollection is that it was twilight, it was just getting dark, and I suddenly realised I was separated from my mother, and here I was in this rather sombre, gloomy looking place, because it was a typical Victorian building, and I remember just crying my eyes out as I realised I was on my own and separated from my mother. That was my earliest recollection as a small child. So I grew up in that home. In many ways, it was the best thing that could have happened to me. I think if we had stayed with my mother, who was a very simple kind of lady, I don't think we would have progressed very much in life. And I think the authorities realised that. And so that was the context in which I grew up. I think I must... Sorry, no, go on.
Well, no, you finished.
Yes, I was evolving as a bit of a rebel in those days, kicking over the traces, and more often than not, I was caned, punished for misbehaviour. And as I look back, had it not been for the grace of God and God entering into my life, I think I would have gone down a very negative pathway in life, and who knows how I would have ended up.
So yeah, so you don't have to go into details now, but we've heard the stories of some brushes with the law, and,
yes.
and you know, so your life could have gone in a very negative direction. Before we go there, tell us. So you were saying you were born. So you were 5 when the Second World War broke out.
That's right.
What are some of your memories of that? Because you would have been in the orphanage of that.
Oh yes, I can clearly remember lying in bed at night and hearing the Luftwaffe and the German planes flying over our house where I lived. And also we were instructed as little children in the primary school that when the German planes came over the head, if we were all playing in the playground, that we would drop to the ground face downwards and stay there until it was safe. That was a common drill that we experienced in those days. And then of course we experienced what they called the doodle bugs. I don't know whether you have heard of that. These bombs, which there were huge bombs that were geared to go so far. They planned the target, and then the engine would switch off and then drop down on its target. And I was evacuated to a town just outside London, because I was born in London. orphanage was a suburb of London, and then the government decided to evacuate us. So in this town of Maidenhead, which is about 30 miles outside of London, we had a glass factory, and one day we heard that dreaded sound of the doodlebug flying overhead, and suddenly the engine cutting out, and then all of us wondering where on earth it was going to land. And it landed on the glass factory. They hit their target, and as a result of that and the reverberation that took place, many of the window panes of houses were shattered. That was something of what I remember of those days, but didn't realise the full significance of what was happening in the world.
So you grew up. I mean, that's a very different, upbringing to my upbringing. You know, I didn't grow up in the war, didn't have that family situation that you described. So that's a pretty difficult situation. And then you were saying, you know, you had some brushes with the law, the wrong side of the law.
Yes.
Could have you going into teens and late teens could have headed in a pretty negative direction. And then you became a follower of Jesus, right? So that was a big change in your life. How did that change things? What difference did that make to you at that point?
Well, I think one of the changes that took place, which God used, was certain men, certain individuals came into my life. And the first one was the headmaster, Mr. Bailey. I remember his name. He tragically died of cancer some years later. But he fathered me. In the Psalms, you probably come across the psalm which says, God is the father of the fatherless. So here I was, virtually fatherless, and also motherless, because my mother took no real active part in my life. And God, in his sovereignty, in his love, in his care, took charge of my life, and he used this headmaster, who for some reason or another, I can only think that it was because God was at work, he took a shine to me and cared for me and gave me particular attention, more than perhaps he gave other boys or girls for that matter. And then there was another person called Mr. Hill. He was the social worker. He was the one who prepared you for the outside world, the job that you were going to do and so on. And he used to get me to dig his allotment. I can picture him now smoking his pipe, standing by the allotment, talking to me, encouraging me, and so on. And then there was my boss, who I worked for in stonemasonry, because I started off in life as a stonemason, carving stone. Worked for some period of time on Canterbury Cathedral, carving stone. Worked with the sculptures of the day in London, became familiar with them. And then eventually, because of ill health, I changed careers and went into the civil service and became chief clerk of a county court. A county court in England is the court that deals with the civil side of the law, not the criminal side. And so I progressed in that area.
On the right side of the law.
I was, yes. And they didn't prevent me from joining the ranks. And then eventually, of course, I became a pastor. And so that is the path, very briefly, that I trod. But these men, particularly Mr. Bailey and Mr. Hill, and then Dave, I forget his surname now, he was an old stonemason, and he took me under his care, and we were involved in a lot of very artistic work and so on, because that was my bent in those days. So these
so that was kind of like those people were light in that darkness, right? I mean, without wanting to stretch that too far, I mean, it always strikes me how in pretty much everybody's story there are certain people who played a role, you know, teachers, coaches, bosses, fathers, who may even not know how important that was. So I mean, the people you just described may not have thought that you would be sat here all those years later
No.
saying how significant that was. And to me, that makes me think about the people that I have the opportunity to impact, and I take some of those opportunities, and there's other opportunities I don't take. But it's very easy to downplay that, I think, the impact we can have in other people's lives. Because we all know the impact that others have had in our lives, but we tend to downplay, I think, the impact we can have in somebody else's life. Let me ask a final question. Like, you lived through the Second World War. I mean, I would imagine. I can remember talking to my mum's, to your wife, my mum's parents about this, because they lost a lot of their family in the war, and it was at the time there was a lot of hatred for Germans and a lot of animosity, and yet now there's been a lot of healing. England and Germany are not in any way. I don't think they probably could have imagined being as peaceful as they are 70 years later. So we've come a long way in that situation since then. But there's been other dark situations, struggles in your own life, as well as in the world. What has helped you maintain hope? Like what's over these years? And I don't want to keep emphasizing your age, but just that you've been doing it a long time, and it's easy to give up. It's easy to despair. What's kept you hopeful? What's kept you a person of peace at heart?
Well, Paul the Apostle talks about God as the God of all hope, and then you read other scriptures like Christ in you, the hope of glory. And I think becoming a Christian, knowing Jesus on a personal level, was the mainstay of my life. And as I look back now, I think, family-wise, relationally, educationally, there was a big hole in my life. It was God that gave me hope, gave me the motivation, gave me the staying power to progress in life, because I didn't come through the normal channels of life. I came sovereignly, by God's grace, into the place of work, the place of promotion and so on.
So would you say then, and this is the first time I've really thought about this, but would you say then that the fact that you had kind of got through those situations, that darkness didn't destroy you, gives you hope in the present moment, that you have, the fact that you've come through something means that there's something is possible, right? That there's a reason for hope. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's never a hopeless situation. And I think, just take my family, take my wife, Patricia, not having any role models in my life for the best part of my life up until I got married. I had no role model to go by. Nobody stood before me as a father. Nobody stood before me as a mother. But by God's grace, He gave me hope in those areas. And so one was able to become a good husband and a good father, at least as far as I can remember.
Well, we'll talk about that afterwards. You've been a great dad. Yeah, you've been a great dad.
In the darkness, I think one of the scriptures that's helped me is in the book of Habakkuk. When he's very concerned about the injustice of things and the unfairness of things, and he's crying out to God. Why do you allow this? And of course, he talks, as you were talking about the violence of today. He was talking about violence in his day, wasn't he? Saying, Lord, why do you allow this? It's unfair. And then after complaining, he can get into chapter 2, where he says, I'll stop complaining. I'll get into my prayer tower. I'll start looking to God, listening for God, and then he gets the vision that the Lord eventually gave him. And I think for me that has been a reality. God has given me vision, despite the lack in my background. The Lord has envisioned me, given me hope, and so on. And another statement that has helped me is that problems, no, I'm trying to remember it now. Excuse me today, I'm a bit sort of not so clear thinking.
You're great.
But I'm trying to think, because it's a very good statement that summed up how I've thought and functioned.
Well, I know you were going to one scripture you wanted to share. Well, maybe we can close out on that, and Dave, do you want to come up with? We'll do the song. We're going to close out with the song. You shared about Psalm 23, right? You mentioned that the other day.
Yes.
It's been something that's been very. Obviously, it's a very famous psalm, and we hear it a lot, but it's very very important to you, and particularly.
Yes, I think the statement is, we live not by explanations, but by promises. So, for example, in Psalm 23, verse 4, it says that, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say, I'll extract you from the valley of death or the valley of deep gloom. It said, I will be with you in that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that has sustained me in my life and in my thinking as a Christian in my walk with God.
Okay, thanks, Dad. Let's give my father thank you. So we're going to sing a song. We're going to sing the song to close out, but let's just have a moment of quiet, and I'm going to pray, and then Dave, you can just lead us and close out. Lord Jesus, we just thank you for that story that we've heard, and we thank you for the Christmas story. Lord, we bring our story to you now. We bring our own lives to you, and the difficulties that we're going through personally. Some of those things seem probably like there's no way out. Or maybe they're things that have happened already and the result of them is just crushing on us. And we also bring you the story that we're in, this story we're part of